When we're talking about grief, we have to think about just the different ways in which it can manifest.
Counselor at Wholeness and Wellness Counseling Services, Akila Riley Richardson, said many characterize grief in one form.
Most people would know about normal grief, right? Which is people presenting with things like sadness or anger or denial or probably depression. That's kind of like what we see as being normal grief. But then we have something called complicated grief.
She said in complicated grief, the individual didn't get the chance to move through the process of grief. Another type of grief is traumatic grief.
This is when the person who has passed in a particularly, let's say, violent way. So the one who is left behind, in addition to dealing with the grief, is also managing the trauma and how the loss happened. So for example, if somebody was violently murdered, in addition to managing the loss, you're also managing just the experience and the dread and just all the symptoms attached to the trauma.
Many are also dealing with inhibited grief, which is best described as grief that isn't being displayed.
It's there, but you're hiding it. And so you may see somebody looking happy, looking relatively functional, but inside that person is grieving. And that person may be grieving because they're experiencing what's called disenfranchised grief. So disenfranchised grief refers to grief that we're not allowed to express, or we don't feel safe to express because persons around us either don't recognize the grief or persons around us don't recognize us.
Next on the list is ambiguous loss. Mrs. Riley Richardson said this type of grief feels like frozen grief.
So what do I mean when I say frozen grief? There are some persons who've lost somebody, but the person they've lost is either physically present but psychologically absent, or psychologically present but physically absent.
She said ambiguous loss is experienced by those who have a kidnapped, missing, or incarcerated loved one.
And it's so different from a typical circumstance, because in a typical circumstance you would know, okay, this person is dead. But when you don't know, then you can't complete the process of grief. So you're frozen in time.
Last on the list is delayed grief.
Sometimes people don't get a chance to really grieve, and then all of a sudden we see symptoms appearing. And some of these symptoms may appear at critical times like birthdays or Christmas.
Join us every Wednesday in the month of December as we look at how the different types of grief can be identified, as well as coping mechanisms for parents and children or teens. I'm Mahalia Joseph Wharton, keeping tabs on your inner circle.